Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this. It's not yet the last panel. We still have a keynote in the end. But this very interesting panel on sexual violence, strategies for change and containment, of course, a very important topic given the discussions in the past week. We are still missing one panelist, and I'm hoping she will be here soon, but I think we can start. So our first presenter today is Alison Finn, who is going to present research she's been doing together with Nail Rahi. And the paper is entitled, Why Are We Still Here? The Gaps in Feminist Advocacy for a Sexual Harassment Law in Lebanon.
Can you hear me? Great. First, I just want to apologize on behalf of Nai, who had to travel, and to say that everything I'm saying today is really the product of our two brains, so don't give me too much credit. So as we know, sexual harassment is commonplace for women and gender non-conforming individuals in Lebanon, particularly for those made doubly vulnerable by their status as refugees, migrant domestic workers, and workers in informal sectors and agriculture who are left out of the labor law. This topic has in no way dominated public discourse in Lebanon, but public awareness around sexual harassment has increased over the last decade in a decentralized way. This is partially due to the work of activists to focus on gender-based violence in the work of NGOs and funding streams. As well as transnational conversations, and I'm not necessarily talking about the West here, but for example, the anti-harassment movement in Egypt. And sexual harassment has become this issue of the moment in the last year, as we've seen, with the Me Too campaign, as well as other media campaigns in Lebanon, like Mish Basita. So Nai and I see this increased attention as an opportunity for change and reflection. It's a chance to continue and strengthen existing work to raise awareness and for legal reform. But this moment also highlights the harsh reality of where we are in Lebanon. There are no real measures to protect people facing harassment in the workplace, on the streets, and beyond. There is no public calling uniformly for its end, and there's no inclusive, broad conversation around the issue. The conversations that are happening are quite limiting. The current law proposed by the Minister of Women's Affairs, Jean Cassapion, that's how I like to say his name, does not reflect the demands of feminist and women's rights organizations. The language in the law, it reflects paternalism and protectionalism. It equates the issue with morality and with the law as a gift to women rather than a right, or rather than an issue of the body. And similarly, the level of public discourse is low. We're not talking about consent. We're talking about convincing the public that targets of sexual harassment are human beings. So this moment of increased attention is a moment of painful questions, which led us to our research question. After years of effort on public awareness campaigns, several proposed laws, and a growing local and transnational activism on the issue of sexual harassment, why are we still here? And we compare this issue of sexual harassment to the issue of family violence in Lebanon, where there has been more tangible progress, at least in terms of legal reformism, with the 2014 passage of the family violence law and public and media consciousness of the issue. So methodologically, Nai and I conducted a literature review, interviews with relevant stakeholders, and personal reflection to understand these two processes as a comparative. Within the context of of broader women's movements in Lebanon and implications for different kinds of feminism. And in the comparative, we're looking at three areas of effort: grassroots awareness, institutional capacity building, so that could be the ISF or the media, for example, and advocacy for legislation. I'm not going to go into the details of our literature review, but we did build quite a lot on Noor Nasser's work to assess the landscape of sexual harassment activism in the last 10 years, which was presented at the Knowledge is Power project. We are building in our literature review and in our thinking on work from NGOs and INGOs like KEFA, Harass Tracker, Amnesty, and Legal Agenda, and Insan. And the family violence law, we're indebted to Lana Khatab's mapping of the advocacy to pass that law. Our key informant interviews were with relevant stakeholders at KEFA, the Adventures of Salwa, which was a project of Nassawiyya, the Knowledge is Power project at AUB, and Harass Tracker. So I'm briefly going to just summarize a little bit of what has been done in both of those. Again, I don't want to replicate the work that has already been done. And then I'll share 5 key findings, 3 recommendations, and implications for feminism. To briefly speak about the family violence law. The 2014 passage of the family violence law followed a decade of intentional mobilization and advocacy led by Munazzamat Kafa, by the NGO Kafa, which formed a 60-stakeholder coalition, at least on paper, around the issue. It combined legislative advocacy, capacity building of different institutions like the media, the ISF, etc., and public engagements, notably that fed into this legislative advocacy, that raised public understanding of technicalities of the law and legislative processes. And this engagement with multiple stakeholders and the subsequent, or rather kind of on the side, massive lobbying of members of parliament transformed family violence into an issue that expanded beyond traditionally feminist or women's rights circles. It allowed people to follow the passage of the law and allowed people to engage with the law as a family issue and as a political issue. There are some consequences and downsides to this that I'll get to later. But one of them is that the resulting law that was passed in 2014 was significantly weaker than the 2007 law proposed by Kefa. It institutionalized certain aspects of gender discrimination that were not in the Lebanese penal code before, like the right to marital rape. And it transformed the issue from a women's issue with domestic violence to a family issue with the renaming of that. So this process showed the sacrifices that key actors had to make in order for the legal reformism process to be successful, again in quotes. In comparison, the sexual harassment movement, activism for sexual harassment has not by any means been that singular. Activism around sexual harassment has been present in Lebanon for decades, stretching back to the demands of women's labor organizing in the 1950s. Thank you, Dima Kadwe, for that. Rather than the 1990s, which is typically credited for. And Noor particularly looked at the sexual harassment movement over the last 10 years, which is when it really became entrenched in the Lebanese kind of NGO landscape. With initiatives like the Adventures of Salwa, which combined awareness videos, reporting and mapping tools, and a public awareness campaign. Media coverage, there's a growing understanding of the issue on university campuses with an increase in student activism around the issue and the institutionalization of anti-harassment measures at AUB with Title IX, for example. Beginning in 2013, beginning calls for a law criminalizing sexual harassment with the Say No to Violence campaigns. In 2014, Legal Agenda and Nasawiya proposed a draft law that was similar to what was then introduced by MP Mukhayber. And that law, however, was much stronger than the one that's really more on the table now, which is the Ministry of Women Affairs law, which was presented in January of last year. Or March of last year, excuse me. The situation, however, the movement lacks a singular champion or a nationwide campaign. The projects are cyclical. There's not really much coherence. Salwa is done. The Knowledge is Power project is done. There was multi-stakeholder engagement, and then where does it go from here? And there's a lack of coordination between grassroots efforts and legislative advocacy, and a lack of consensus around whether legislative advocacy is actually the answer. Some activists think that a law is necessary to pull the conversation out of elite activist spaces, and others consider that serious conversations around behavioral shifts on sexual harassment are more important than penalization. So that's briefly the situation, and I want to focus on our findings from these interviews and our document analysis. The first is that sexual harassment doesn't carry its own significance and its own weight. And thus, work on sexual harassment is thus dispersed and unintentional in contrast to domestic violence, family violence. Family violence can be distilled into a bloody, physical, violent act, whereas conversations around sexual harassment are more inserted peripheral to conversations around gender-based violence in general. This is true in the literature, in calls for proposals from international donors, research reports from Lebanese civil society, and media discussions. So it's not surprising that there is no public mobilization when the issue is not one that's singularly addressed. And this kind of hidden nature of the debate has caused an internal debate in activist spaces around how to frame the issue of sexual harassment to make people in power and make the public care, just at a baseline level. But what must be sacrificed in this reframing? Do activists adopt the language of morality, of the family that activists pushing for the domestic violence law adopted? Or is there an insistence on the conversation about rights, the body, and consent? And what are the results and the implications of that? Our second finding, pretty straightforward, is that the family violence law passed because of a combination of legislative advocacy, public awareness, and institutional capacity building that was pushed in parallel, and this has yet to happen for sexual harassment. Our third finding is that there is cause for encouragement. There is growing student activism on the issue, like I mentioned before, both where there is a university infrastructure for these conversations, like with Title IX at AUB or the Women's Institute at LAU, and where this does not exist at other universities. And there's also a number of growing young feminist groups and spaces like the Feminist Network, Harass Tracker, Damme, Female, that address the issue of sexual harassment both explicitly and implicitly. Okay, great. This is a positive factor. Our fourth finding is that external and global factors contribute significantly to the current debate on sexual harassment. The importance of Me Too repeatedly came up in our conversations with our stakeholders. Donors are pushing gender-based violence in general. And these factors don't necessarily lead the conversation, but they certainly guide the conversation. And there are important consequences to this. The main one is it limits who can participate in these conversations. When a primary part of the sexual harassment movement is located at AUB with the Knowledge is Power project, which is funded by American government donors, some people don't participate because they can't afford to be associated with those institutions, or they don't want to be, or people don't want to be associated with the feminist movement in general. And second, the danger of Me Too is that it frames sexual harassment as this issue that is inspired by debate in the West, and that ignores the history of labor organizing here in Lebanon and obscures the indigeneity of the movement and the complex ways in which calls for rights travel transnationally. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, key discussions are absent from both public debate in the media and activists working on the issue of sexual harassment around the risks of criminalization and the impact of the law on marginalized groups. The move towards criminalization is part of a trend of policing behavior and individual rights. A law could easily give security forces more reasons to target Syrians, Palestinians, and male migrant workers, increasing the marginalization and applying protections very selectively to specific groups of women. So what do we recommend? Assuming that the goal is passage of a sexual harassment law, it's clear that we need a comprehensive strategy that combines legislative advocacy and public awareness raising. But we want to move beyond this recommendation. So we state that the law is not enough to change the situation. Legal reform does not capture justice, especially for the issue of sexual harassment. A punitive approach works in some cases of family violence because there is a clear risk of safety, right? There is a body, there is a human being that's on the line, but sexual harassment doesn't have the same marked injuries and effects, and perhaps a restorative approach is more needed than a punitive one. Our second recommendation is to broaden the focus of the debate and who is included in it. The focus on criminalization within the workplace, for example, is not enough, as the majority of employed women in Lebanon work informally, and workplace criminalization, labor law doesn't help them, doesn't help migrant domestic workers, doesn't help agricultural workers, for example. Second, that the engagement of public discussion should include conversations about what should be criminalized itself and how people understand harassment. What kind of a law is needed and what are the consequences of it? And perhaps that's the only thing that could really discourage this trickle-down elitist approach that legal reformism automatically engenders. And our third recommendation is that this fight is actually an opportunity to publicly identify women as people and not only as addendums to the family unit, which was the result of the family violence law. The family violence battle opened the gates for a change in discourse on women's rights in Lebanon and their role in society, and marked that things can change after a lot of effort. It also taught us, however, that the MPs are not going to pass a law that challenges the importance of the family or the balance within the family. Okay. And the law that passed firmly embedded firmly embedded women as members of the family unit and didn't go beyond that. This sacrifice, again, like I said earlier, perhaps was worth it for the issue of family violence, but some of the activists we talked to around sexual harassment are pushing instead for a law that focuses more on the act itself and the power structures behind it when the results are not physical injuries. If the law can't address that, if the law would reinforce women as simply members of a family, perhaps penalization is not the right approach. Perhaps it's okay if it takes time to get to a law that is more complex. So I just want to spend my last minute or two reflecting a bit, I know that was a lot of information, but reflecting a little bit on what our paper, or how our paper interacts with the topic of this conference, Feminism in Crisis. Further thinking is definitely needed. These are just a few quick insights. The first is that the primary type of feminism that was deployed in the family violence criminalization debate was a liberal feminism that pushes for legal reform. And this type of liberal feminism focused on legal reform elides key questions around the risks of criminalization. It doesn't ask what happens after the law is passed or who it can be used against justly and unjustly. And that focus shifts the issue away from gender justice. And secondly, that the family violence law promoted two other feminisms. One, a conservative type of feminism that again focused on women as part of the family. And two, a professionalized feminism that again made this space of reform about women who work in NGOs, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A. But in both cases, both of these feminisms are feminisms that pragmatically bargain with the patriarchy. So in the case of the domestic violence law, legal gains involving government stakeholders, et cetera, led to a more compromising feminist stance. This was necessary to bring results, but it can be seen as a dangerous strategy. It involves taking on the government position publicly and trying to make quick fixes in order to get a small victory, because that's better than no victory at all. But the sexual harassment movement has not made the sacrifices, and to conclude, perhaps that is why we are here. Activists, intentionally or not, have not adopted the small victory position and have not negotiated with the patriarchy in the same way. That's why legislative advocacy perhaps has not moved further. The alternate strategy, public mobilization, shifting the conversation, can be effective, but perhaps it takes more time and a bit more sweat and effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. I'm sure we will have an interesting debate at the end. I'll move now to the second paper by Fatima Moussawi and Monach Neisser, both from IFI. And the paper is about public policy and sexual violence in Lebanon, questioning the public-private binaries.
Thank you. I will not open the presentation. I will just follow here. Okay. Hello, everyone. First, I would like to thank you for offering us the chance to present here and to present this paper that was prepared by my colleague Monach Neisser and myself. We are both researchers at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. And we wanted in this paper that was based on a wide mapping of the literature to cover how different forms of gender-based violence, including sexual violence against women in Lebanon, are questioned and are affected by the present private-public binary that is definitely present in Lebanon as it is present in the Arab world and in different countries. First of all, I would like to give headlines of what the presentation will contain. First, we will talk about gender-based violence and some of its forms, like domestic violence and sexual harassment, as both examples from the private sphere and the public sphere, the public-private binaries and their effect on shaping the individual and public perception towards gender-based violence, in addition to the effect of this dichotomy on the legislative reaction and the consequences on women. And also, the paper addressed the evolution of the role of civil society organizations in addressing the aforementioned issues, and what was covered basically as well by Alison and Nay's paper. In the beginning, we note the outstandingly growing presence of women in different public domains in comparison to previous decades. This presence is exposing women to public space and therefore to the circumstances that surround this presence in society that tends to exercise and adopt till today the patriarchal norms and relation when it comes to the explanation of male dominance. In fact, despite the notable claim of women on public sphere, they often experience discriminatory and exclusionary practices in public space, within educational institutions, within their workspace, and they are frequently and their space is frequently invaded by different forms of physical assaults. Unfortunately, even educational institutions, as mentioned, and workplaces are particular public sites where women are facing discriminatory and harassment acts. While women are exposed to both the private realm, which is mostly the house or the home, and the public realm, which is the street, the public transportation, the workspace, hospital, a university, etc., to different types of violence, how can we, in fact, assess and measure and react to these types of violence, given the two particularities of these spheres, the public and the private sphere? As well, in response to these several forms of physical assaults, different progressive actions were taken by civil society organizations that started many decades ago, but as mentioned also by Alison, were particularly clear from mid-90s till today. Civil society's response towards gender-based violence is not unified, and it varied from the initial act of service provision and listening and counseling, arriving till the ultimate form of drafting the laws, of advancing the laws in the cabinet of ministers and in the parliament, and monitoring and advocating for the statement of protective and effective protective laws. First, I will talk about women in public space and how this presence in public space is creating tensions around the presence of women. And I will start by what Daphne Spain mentioned while approaching the urban theory, by stating that from the shift from private to public, there is acknowledgement to the role of women that played a very crucial and essential role in reshaping urban structure. And in their move from the domestic realm to the public labor market, women have served in reshaping the cities out of the necessity their move created for institutional provisions, for childcare, elderly care, food services, security, to fill the gap that once was occupied by housekeeping women. However, women's use of public space has been profoundly affected and by the association of certain public spaces and times with incidences of sexual harassment and different types of violence and sexual assaults against women, which questions the female presence in the public space and raises real concerns about the insecurity experienced by women and their urban security and in general, and the place of women in the city. Women may face constraints that hinder their mobility, that hinder their productivity and their economic, their fundamental right to enjoy public space because of the presence of this exposure to different kinds of sexual harassment or assaults. The issue of sexual harassment, specifically street harassment and violence against women in public space, has become more and more familiar, and women constantly have to started to deal with remarks, with improper conduct, which constituted a violation to their sexual, physical, and moral integrity. They were also exposed to different accidents that are not only hindering their safety but also their productivity and therefore their growing effect and the engagement in the public space and urban life, which lead us to the question: is the public space a men's space? Is it a is it actually a movement from the private patriarchy to the public patriarchy? Because women entered this public space but not on equal terms with men. The public-private dichotomy is central to feminist movement that expressed the slogan, the famous slogan, "The personal is political," which is a critique to the traditionally forged wall that separated between the political and the public sphere, consisting of state, government, and between the private sphere that comprised the family and personal relationships. Feminists accused the classical liberal philosophers and scholars of outcasting the private or the domestic sphere from their indulgence, whereas the state has been sanctioned the authority and legitimacy to interfere and legislate on the subjects that fall under the public sphere. The private has been left untouched. And this is very clear, specifically in the Lebanese case, because the issue of domestic violence was left for a long time untouched because of this debate around the private aspect of this issue and the private aspect of family that is considered another kind of state in Lebanon because of the patriarchal form of the society that can mirror in a certain way the patriarchal form of the hierarchy in a family. The public-private dichotomy is the meanings assigned to public and private domains result from public realm as being perceived as superior value and role given culturally and politically to the male sphere, while relegating women to the domestic realm of reproduction, privacy, and family care. Domestic violence remains largely obscured given the construction of private sphere as personal and existing outside of the state and public intervention. And it has taken years from the feminist movement to roll back the normative acceptance of a gender-based violence, especially domestic abuse and sexual harassment, as natural expressions of manhood. Activist groups and organizations as well have been working on a globe consciousness-raising movement to generate a common value system that criminalizes gender-based violence and questions gender stereotypes and re-evaluates this private-public dichotomy. In fact, when we talk about domestic violence, and when we talk about domestic violence, definitely including one of the most significant types of sexual violence, which is marital rape, we talk about a complexity in the definition because domestic violence is determined by different political, cultural, economic, and social factors, which challenges a simple policy response and necessitates the presence of more collaborative efforts in order to address the different aspect of this type of violence, specifically when it comes to the degendered interpretation of this violence, because if you want to tackle domestic violence, for example, we need to understand that it is based on the different factors that cannot be addressed by a criminal law. Therefore, there is the need to address them through a determined law. And Lebanon, it's only until 2014 that Lebanon and civil society organizations led by CAFA and the coordination of CAFA were able to move this issue to the public attention and to the public awareness after long years of advocacy, and to take it further by the statement of the law. However, the law still was contradicted and hindered by this very private element that cannot take it further to criminalize marital rape, which is one of as mentioned, most significant sexual abuse women can be exposed to in a house play, in the house sphere. Also, when we talk about when we talk about sexual harassment, we can also feel that there is this problem that was faced always by women, and to the equal right to access the public space. Because of a certain type of spatial masculinity that finds that emphasize the public harassment women receive by men as form of appropriation of space in face of the female that is considered that is considered in an indirect way as an intruder to the public space, which is delimiting the right of women of the enjoyment of this public space. I will move quickly to the role played by CSOs, which has been taken for many decades and expressed during the last couple of years by the statement in 2014 of the domestic violence law that did not target women specifically, but it was a family law which takes away from the attention that should be given to the woman because she is the target of the domestic violence primarily. It was diluted when it was given this family aspect. And the efforts that were made as well to advance a sexual harassment law and to abolish the rape law lately in August 2017 as the rape law law was abolished, but still these two laws, the sexual harassment law and the abolishment of the rape law, still in need for more advanced efforts in order to allocate the right of women for public space in a more integral and protective way. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Fatima. Just before we move on, I want to make sure that our last speaker is not in the room. Camille Dinchoy? No? Okay, so we'll move now to our last speaker on this panel, Helen Rizzo from the American University of Cairo, and the presentation is about redefining masculinities in anti-gender-based violence initiatives.
Okay, thank you very much, Rima, and thank you all for coming. I'll go right into it. Notions of responsibility are intimately tied, if not always explicitly, to conceptions of masculinities and femininities in both collective and individual practices. Projects for gender justice and women's empowerment imply masculine responsibility in formulating the problem and suggestions for reform. But men, while deemed responsible, are often not directly targeted by women's rights organizations in their awareness and conscious raising campaigns and projects to promote gender equality. The implications of not directly addressing the role of men and masculinities in projects for gender justice need to be examined. Until gender, masculinities, and femininities is fully addressed, particularly in the area of gender-based violence, such projects will most likely not be successful in the long term. The research that I'm presenting today is a work in progress and part of a larger project that examines Cairo-based initiatives against sexual harassment in public spaces and gender-based violence in general to see if it is necessary to invoke traditional masculine modes of responsibility and protection in order to change men's perceptions and behavior as well as public opinion. It will also explore if any of these initiatives are redefining masculinities in the Cairo context and engaging men in their struggles against public space harassment in order to increase the success of their work. In order to examine how the various initiatives deal with engaging men and masculinities, the project is based on field work done with the following groups. the Egyptian Center for Women's Rights Anti-Harassment Campaign, which was one of the first to launch a campaign against sexual harassment in September of 2005. I conducted 4 years of fieldwork with this organization from 2006 to 2010, so I did participant observation for 1 year. I had interviews and email correspondence with staff and volunteers involved in the campaign. I did a content analysis of ECW literature from 2006 to 2009, and including staff notes on campaign and meeting minutes, and I did follow-up interviews with staff and volunteers in 2015 and 16 to specifically address the issues of engaging men and masculinities. I became involved with HarassMap, which was launched in 2010 to fighting to end the social acceptability of sexual harassment. I began working with the group involved 2011 on a grant proposal, and then I became a research consultant with them on this project of comparing the data they were collecting through crowdsourcing versus traditional social science methods of collecting data about harassment. And then during this time, I was able to get access their literature, be involved in public events, staff meetings, and I also did in-depth interviews with staff and volunteers during 2015 and 16, again, specifically about engaging men and masculinities. So I did the majority of my fieldwork during this time, and through observations and in-depth interviews, I also looked at groups that began after the January 25th 2011 uprising, operational anti-sexual harassment, the imprint movement against sexual harassment, and I also interviewed staff from gender-based violence organizations, Nazra for Feminine Studies, the Center for Egyptian Women's Legal Assistance, the El Nadim Center for Rehabilitation of Victims of Violence, and the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. And I did more recent interviews with people from Girls Revolution, another initiative started after 2011, and tried to find more male volunteers and staff from all of these groups. And I also talked to the National Council for Women on their national strategy to end violence against women, and UN Women on the work they're doing to end gender-based violence. So to date, I've interviewed about 30 people from these various organizations and initiatives. So what I found, or why I became interested in if these groups were trying to engage men and masculinities, was when I was doing fieldwork with ECWR, and they were doing a campaign called Making Our Streets Safer for Everyone, and they were trying to invoke this idea of community responsibility for solving the problem and moving away from the discourse of harassment is only a women's problem. And so they were struggling to direct a message to men. A marketing research firm volunteered to help them develop public service announcements in the early stages of the campaign. So this marketing research group met with various focus groups, and they were developing PSAs asking men to protect women from harassment in public spaces. And the messages appeared to appeal to this certain aspect of masculinity and community. I was in one of these focus groups of foreign and Egyptian American women in 2007, and some of what they were proposing is making public service announcements by asking men to see all women as their mothers and wives and sisters and daughters. So the goal was that men it was to try to stop men from harassing, or to get men to intervene if they see a woman harassed because she's someone's relative. Many of us in the room felt uncomfortable with this idea because of its use of protection and implying the physical weakness of women to protect themselves. I mean, we understood that it was trying to convince men that women do not deserve to be harassed and should intervene, but by using these kinship terms to evoke masculine responsibility, the campaign was hoping that would make them realize that harassment was inappropriate, not to do it, maybe intervene if they see other men engaging in this behavior. And we understood that maybe this was a way to engage men, or it might resonate with men. We felt this tactic could backfire, and even though they never questioned a woman's right to access public space, some of us felt, appealing to protection would imply that would undermine women's struggles for equality, reinforce the idea that women are weak and can't defend themselves, and it might risk also more surveillance and social control disguised as protection. That men, there's so much harassment, I cannot let my wife and daughter and sister go out and access public space. And then another group, a focus group of mostly Egyptian American University in Cairo students, they also argued that this message that women should be protected like one sister was, again, sending the message that women aren't equal or empowered. And they also argued that the sister image would not work because men could claim that they only harass women who are dressed inappropriately or behaving inappropriately, and their sisters are respectful. So they would not harass women who dress like their sisters. So this is what AUC students were like, this isn't going to work because they won't see these women as someone deserving of their intervention or help. But ECAWR didn't take this track in their campaign. But this left me with the question of this challenge, though. How do women's rights organizations try to get men engaged? How do you appeal to masculine responsibility without reinforcing traditionalist notions of masculinity and patriarchy? How do you get men to start to think critically about what harassment means and how it prevents women from feeling safe in accessing public space, and try to get them to change their attitudes and behaviors? So this idea of maybe community and responsibility could be the first step in trying to get men to alter their ideas of masculinity or what it means to be a good man. A good man. So these were the issues I wanted to further explore as I started to talk to more groups and initiatives and organizations working against gender-based violence. Especially in my more recent interviews, this was really the focus. And as I noticed, looking at the spectrum of these new organizations, often started by both men and women, people under the age of 40, that it was kind of this new generation of activism that emerged, especially after 2011, the uprising in Cairo. And I became very interested, so why are men are on the staff of some of these organizations? They're volunteering. What drew them into this type of activism? And so keep in mind, what I'm going to present today is a very preliminary analysis of my interview data from this kind of one aspect of the project, what drew some of these men to become very active. So I noticed, or in my preliminary analysis, that the type of activities affected the kind of men who would join or volunteer. So several of the groups, particularly in this period of between 2011 and 2013, when there was a lot of activism around all kinds of issues, some of the groups started patrolling areas around the holidays that were known to have increased levels of harassment during major holidays, to try to deter men from harassing and help men to escape harassment. And this was also very similar to the groups who went to the protests to try to pull women out of these group sexual assaults that was happening, of course, during the demonstrations during this period. So during these type of activities tended to attract men who wanted to be heroic by saving women from sexual violence. It was very men who are very physically strong, which was an asset, especially during these demonstrations and protests, to be able to pull women away from these mobs of men when they were being insulted and assaulted. So they were this idea of being physically tough. But I mean, both male and female activists said the problem was that this type of man, it seemed like this just reinforced their beliefs that women were weak, needed to be saved and protected. And usually these men did not continue volunteering once the protesting stopped or patrolling during the holidays became more difficult to do. So they were more interested in direct intervention, action, the fight, than strategizing about how to achieve more long-term solutions. But some of my interviewees observed those who were willing to stay and get involved in other types of activism, awareness raising through the media, trainings, other kinds of campaigns, they began to see this problem as one of gender inequality and started to internalize the idea that women were equal and they should have the same access to public space as men and not fear or feel that public space is dangerous. And even some of the men who worked on the intervention teams with women in helping women to escape these mob sexual assaults, in the beginning, of course, they didn't want women involved because, well, now I have to protect you while I'm also trying to pull these women out of the group assaults. But one group in particular, Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment, said no, we have to be on the intervention teams because we do not want to reinforce this idea that you as a man are going to save women, that we feel this is a problem. We're going to go out and try to get these survivors of sexual assault together. And several of these men, through this experience, realized that women were strong and courageous. Even who they were helping, the survivors of the assault, that they saw that the survivor was brave because she was able to survive and go on. So not only the women they were working with to help women from these group assaults, but the women who suffered from the assaults they saw as brave survivors. So this was life-changing for some of them. So they went from being against women being on the intervention teams to really seeing women as courageous partners in helping to rescue women from these assaults. And of course, these various groups, regardless of the type of activity, also attracted men who I characterize as being allies or partners in the struggle for gender equality and to end gender-based violence. And these men seem to be very empathetic in particular, fair-minded. They thought it was unfair that they could access public space easily, and it was unfair that women didn't have this ease of using public space, that they deserve the same rights to use public space safely. They were open to seeing gender-based violence from a feminist point of view. And several of my interviewees also noted, and some of the men themselves were drawn to these types of groups because a close relative or friend had experienced assault or abuse or harassment, or they themselves were a victim of some kind of abuse or trauma, maybe from a domestic violence situation, being bullied at school or on the street for appearing weak or not manly, not meeting some norm of dominant or hegemonic masculinity. And so this made them very empathetic with others who experienced this type of violence, and they really wanted to be part of something to try to solve the problem. So as I said, I'm at the very beginning stages of my analysis, and okay, great. And I'm sure as I go more deeply into my transcripts and interview data, I'm going to find other categories of men who've become involved in this work, other categories more than just men as protectors or men as allies, this dichotomy I just presented. But what this initial analysis indicates that there are multiple masculinities at play in this context, even among this subset of men in a particular type of gender activism. So in addition to using R.W. O'Connell's work on different kinds of masculinity, of course the most famous being hegemonic, but he also includes there's complicitous, marginalized, and subordinated, with these latter two categories potentially could be very useful for my research. I also will incorporate Marcia Inhorn's emergent masculinities, which she used in her work on infertile couples in Egypt, Lebanon, the UAE, and the US. And I think I like this idea of or a concept of emergent masculinities because it recognizes that masculinity is not static, but in a state of flux. New masculinities are constantly emerging, and men across the region themselves are questioning traditional stereotypes, and that their lives are very different from their fathers. So this is particularly relevant to my study because most of these activists, I said, are under the age of 40, so they see themselves as both the men and women as part of the new youth activism that is different from the professionalized NGO type of activism that we've seen across the region. And I think particularly these young men who I'm calling allies are questioning traditional patriarchal current hegemonic notions of masculinity. They're trying to rethink what it means to be a good man or a good person. And those who work for or volunteer with more feminist organizations told me that the conversations and the discussions they've had with their colleagues, both men and women, have really compelled them to think more deeply and critically about masculinity, that they felt really changed how they think and behave. I'll quote Marsha Enhorn: "Men enact manhood in different ways from moment to moment as they move through different contexts that form their daily lives. Individual masculinities also change in response to larger life changes. By calling for an emergent masculinities approach, I call for attention to this ongoing relational and embodied process of change in the ways men enact masculinity." So I really hope what I want to do is to build on these recent studies about masculinities in the Arab world, such as Marsha Enhorn's work and Farhad Ranam's work on a working class neighborhood in Cairo. I feel they really humanize, contextualize, historicize men and masculinity to a particular time and place in the region. They're serious about studying men as gendered subjects and as human beings who want to be good members of society, whether as husbands, fathers, workers, activists, brothers, even with their flaws. And I'm hoping to be able to produce the type of ethnography for this project, this type of ethnography, and to provide new insights into changing masculinities of young male activists, as well as how these newer post-2011 uprising anti-gender-based violent groups are trying to engage men and reconceptualize masculinities in their activism. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. So we have a lot of time for debate. I'll just try to summarize or maybe give a few hints at what we might want to debate. So, I mean, one thing that comes up clearly in the three presentations, I think, is this discussion of strategies and tactics and anti-harassment, anti-gender-based violence campaigning or movement. So do we bargain? Do we not bargain? Do we negotiate? Do we not negotiate? Is this why some movements are more, or campaigns are more effective than others? But with this, of course, also comes the question of what are the principles and the ideologies and the types of feminisms that are behind these campaigns and these movements. So I'll just mention a few bullet points that have been discussed. A legal approach versus other types of approach, campaigns, for example, or social movements, or is it necessary through law that we should address the issue of gender-based violence or sexual violence? The issue of should it be approached as from a moralist perspective or from a rights and consent perspective? The question of women as members of families and the discourse around the family and or the framing of the movement in those terms, or more focus on women and as individuals and or as groups. The punitive criminalization approach versus a more restorative approach, as Alison has mentioned. The question of the public and private sphere and what these different types of violence within the public or the private sphere can tell us about ways to resist as feminists. And finally, the issue of men, masculinities versus, I would say, patriarchies and structures. Is harassment a women's issue? Do we need to engage men specifically, or is it a question of masculinities, or do we think about it in different terms? So I'll open the floor for your questions, and I'm sure we will have an interesting debate. No questions? I thought an interesting debate.
Okay.
If you can just introduce yourself.
Okay, so hello. Alison, thank you for your intervention. I have a question about the legislative activism you mentioned. When you were talking about the type of activism that happened around the domestic violence, so you called it liberal feminism. I mean, okay. So my question is, we are always stuck in these categories and these labels. We tend to like, this is liberal feminism, this is abolitionist, this is... But the thing that happened after the domestic violence law was lobbied for and passed is that discursively people know now what is domestic violence. That was not that popular. That knowledge was not popular. You know, if you ask people in 2008 about domestic violence, it's different than asking them now. In 2008, this is when CAFA started. So how can we negotiate this this relation while also acknowledging? I mean, incarceration is not my favorite type of lobbying or anything that has to do with the prison complex at all. But yeah, how can we negotiate this? Like,
Hi, thank you everyone. I'm Hamad from AUB. I have a very general question. I didn't notice. Well, forgive me, best. I didn't hear anything about the role of like someone's social, like the victim's social background, and how it plays into how gender-based violence gets reported, and whether or not like someone is held accountable for it. Because there are some people who are victims who they never see any form of justice, mainly because of their backgrounds, and then so there's some other people. They do see justice, and sometimes some people are wrongly accused of it, and they just find anyone to blame. Like in certain cases, I'm not going to them up now, but like can I get a better idea about the role of someone's like socioeconomic background?
is it addressed to Anis?
No, just generally. Yeah.
I have a few comments and questions. I start with Alison. First of all, I would like to thank the three of you for the fantastic work you are doing. For Alison, what in your presentation there was also some forms of alliance building, and I agree with the previous speaker, because when you have an issue and this issue gets other different groups interested in it, or why I have to categorize people. The most important thing is that the agenda to choose what to defend was not, out of universal discourse or something. I mean, you have people who are suffering, or you have people who have interest in changing this situation. This call, this cry attracted different people coming from different walks. So this is a great success in my opinion. Why do I need to qualify this came for what purpose and this came, for this purpose or that purpose? So I would like to hear, more on that, and as you said, that you will give more details in the discussion. Thank you so much for the. And here I will go back to the, bargaining with patriarchy, because sometimes it is important to hold accountable the adversary with their own beliefs and values. And the question of the family as the private, I think feminist, theories and feminist thinking did a lot of work about breaking this dichotomy. Because when they decide what is the age of marriage, who has the right to divorce, who has to be the wakil in the marriage, this is interfering in the private sphere of the family. So the issue is not to interfere in the family as an argument. It is about what sort of deeds within the family that the state interfere or refuse to interfere. So one of the things that the violence within the family that deals with women is considered as private. But when it comes to other family members, and even the same men and women, when it comes to issues related to custody and divorce and the state of the family, the state is everywhere, So I am not quite sure to what extent it is useful here to take the theoretical framework of public-private, because the private is really public, I go back, of course, to Carol Batman and the sexual contract, and it was all there. Helen. When I grew up in Egypt, this issue of sexual harassment was not there in the public streets. Yes, we used to have mu'akasat, and also always with nice comments, and we used to love as little girls, to be followed by young boys and hear these nice, compliments and jokes and stuff like this. The institution who introduced the notion that the public space is dangerous for women is the government. It was a form of control and governing the public. So here it is not a masculine or men's issue, it is a power issue. A power issue that was systematically used and by the government. And this is something I felt it very strongly way before 2011, when my sisters were complaining a lot about terrible forms of corruption in school system. That if they don't pay bribes to the teachers, they will fail their. So I said, why don't you come together as mothers and do something about it? Why don't you do a sit-in the street or go to a demonstration in front of the Ministry of Education and do something about it? And her response, she was, shocking for me. Are you crazy? Because they will harass us sexually. This is the term she used. And she meant the government itself. So putting, the issue on the culture or on the sense of masculinities, etc., without really dealing with the deep roots of, violence, sexual violence in the streets of Egypt, I don't know to what extent it could be helpful in this case.
Okay, since we have plenty of time, how about we do a round of answers and then another round of questions? Because we have time to debate.
I'll start with Isla's question because she directed her one of her questions to me. When do you see that the Egyptian government started to say public space was a dangerous place? And did you mean for women or for both men and women?
No, it's basically for women.
Okay.
My sister, she told me that when she went to administration and there was like undercover agents, they were pinching women.
Yeah, I mean, I do know that there's been several incidents, even before, like you said, before 2011. I think there was in, I I think it was 2005, when Mubarak was going to have a referendum, and we're going to have a multi-party or multi-candidate elections, and there was a big protest in front of this, I think, the journalism syndicate, because concerns about the flaws in how this was going to be done, and that female journalists and protesters were harassed by what most people suspect were thugs from the government. And also, I think, and especially even during 2011, 2012, there were talks of, is some of this targeting of female protesters, was some of it government thugs? I mean, some of it may have been a combination of some people intentionally trying to intimidate protesters, and then other men joining in because there's the opportunity, like, you know, the collective mob. But I think you are right that I didn't incorporate it in my talk, but I will have to incorporate it in my project, that what is the role of the state in perpetuating violence? I mean, and especially, I mean, the Nadine Center's work has been on male and female people who've been arrested, that the sexual violence, abuse in police stations, etc., that the state is implicated in certain types of sexual violence, as you said, whether...
Gendered, actually, because it was a nice question when you asked, because they're knifing, you know, from thugs for men, but, you know, touching and, you know...
All right, so this intimidation of protesters, whether male or female, they get it's gendered how they're being intimidated. So yeah, so I think I do need to make sure that's incorporated in the larger project, and maybe I'll stop here so the others can answer.
Okay, thank you for your questions. I will answer Muhammad's question about the socioeconomic factor as one of the factors that might maybe stop women from going and seek help in case she's exposed to a kind of violence. And I go back to the part where I talked about the gendered aspect of domestic violence, and socioeconomic factor is one of the factors, because women usually in a family, in some type of patriarchal societies, do not earn money and do not spend money in the house. They remain under the mercy of the economic power of their husbands, or sometimes abusive husbands, and do not go to seek help because there is no economic alternative. And Law 293 that was stated in 2014 had in its initial form, and the way CAFA and the coalition pushed for it, had stated that there is a need to establish kind of a national fund in order to address this issue, to kind of secure economic coverage for women who are seeking protection from abusive husbands and who do not have the economic protection for the economic means for this protection. But up till now, it's not something that is practiced because of this limited implementation and for some of the parts of the law. But definitely this will remain one of the reasons why women would not report, and one of the reasons why the law would not be fully implemented and protective and effective in protection. As for the question you raised, sorry, excuse me, can I have your So for the question you raised about the public-private dichotomy, yes, I believe that it is a very fluid two spheres. What is private might be public, but in Lebanon, and specifically pre-2014, pre the statement of the Law 293, whenever a woman, and this is reported in many testimonies from women who were exposed to domestic violence, used to go to ISF, to police centers to report, there was no reaction or no support based on the idea that this is a private issue, this is a family issue, we do not interfere. So this law came to break this solid view about the private aspect of the violence. And in Lebanon, maybe when it comes to other aspects like custody and inheritance, we are under the mercy of another kind of violence, which is the sectarian laws. Because in Lebanon we have 18 laws, and for each sect, and women will not only remain imprisoned by the private sphere, but also by what is imposed by their sects. Because even if they want to resort in custody or in inheritance, which is another type of another kind of bargain with men, they will have to resort to these courts, to these religious courts, which that do not favor women in all the cases. So I think one of the good things that happened with the statement of the Law 293 was the breaking of this private aspect of domestic violence and making it a bit of a public concern, public issue, but it remains till now because we did not actually went so far in implementing the law and in advancing this culture of breaking the private sphere of violence. It will remain until unlimited or unknown period of time, a private issue that needs to be brought completely to the public awareness and public consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll address the questions from Dr. Jad and Maya together, and thank you so much for those interventions. Nai and I had many late-night conversations on the same topic. I hope I do her proud. I think one of the main questions is, when you're addressing an issue as urgent as domestic violence, when there are lives on the line, and when the push for the law successfully raises public awareness of the issue, what is the benefit of putting labels on this and that, and what is there's a risk of alienating and cracking some of those alliances, and I agree. Maya, I think I would even go further than to say that the work that the coalition did to push for the law not only raised public awareness, I think it also set the stage for future reform. There's a law on the books now, and there's efforts to improve some of these issues with it. So I think part of public awareness raising is for the ongoing process, not just the singular event, and I believe that's important. So second, however, I would reframe what I presented and say that it doesn't so much matter that it's liberal feminism, but that the movement knowingly used tools of liberal feminism in order to pass the law. So taking you're nodding, like obviously, because it's an obvious point, but taking on legal reform, moderating the language, etc. And I think it's important to bring this level of critical analysis because we're now at a point where that decade of work has been deemed as successful. There's a shift in focus towards sexual harassment, and we have a clear blueprint. And is that blueprint the right one to follow, and what are the risks of following that in an issue that is parallel but not the same? So that's why I would bring it up to both of you. And going back to this question of, do the same sacrifices need to be made, or is there a way to engage in the discourse a little bit differently? Do we have to use the tools of liberal feminism? Are there other options, like Dr. Majid said? Does that answer your question? Great.
I have a comment.
Awesome, wonderful, yay! Debates. And just briefly, I wanted to add from Muhammad, I would just say that thank you for bringing up a socioeconomic background. I think that also needs to be part of the conversation in what a law does, whether it's around domestic violence or sexual harassment, and who, because people without privilege are going to be criminalized by that law more often. So it's not just an issue of reporting, but it's an issue in how the law is used in policing conduct as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we'll take another round of questions. There was a question there. No more?
First, thank you all for really interesting conversations. And in line with questions before, I just want to make a quick point on the kind of politicizing the, sexual harassment. I think is one point that I want to make, which really is a kind of political tactic. I think not necessarily intentional, but it's a political tactic to maintain this divide between the public and private sphere, where you're out, women are out in the public, so I mean you're obviously going to be harassed. So stay home, don't leave here, stay in the public sphere where you belong. That sort of. Second, I have a question for Fatima and Alison with respect to Law 293. So I'm just wondering, Alison, about how do we kind of figure this? Are we going to be satisfied with these incremental gains, or if they are incremental gains, or do we just take what we get? But there's other issues that need to be dealt with. For example, you talked about marital rape and how much really this kind of legislation of this sort of thing was lobbied against by religious institutions, which I don't think, I'm not sure if you mentioned or you didn't, but that was, I mean, they have quite a large power in the state on these things. So I just wanted to hear your take on that. Thanks.
Hello, Mohammed Jamil from AUC. I'm here by accident, and yeah, not by accident this event, but I found the event. Yes, I'm in Beirut, so why not? Actually, I want to make a comment on Dr. Helen. Have you ever thought of geographical distribution and geography and sexual violence? I mean, for example, and everyone comes to Cairo and see where the new campus, AUC new campus, usually they ask me, oh, you are in desert, it's a different city, it's always, it's not Cairo, why you call it Cairo? I feel the sexual violence, is the concept of sexual violence in New Cairo, for example, is totally different than Cairo. The people mentality or tolerance toward each other is much more obvious than in Cairo, the core of Cairo. So this is my point. Maybe you can see other districts similar to New Cairo, or I mean, each district in Cairo has different.
But you're saying like the suburban ring versus the core.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joanna. So I have several thoughts. First of all, I wanted to say that I think that the point raised about socioeconomic status is very important, but there's also other factors such as race, legal status. So I see, for example, I don't think a migrant worker would receive the same treatment from police than a Lebanese woman. I think, for example, people like sex workers cannot go to the police because they risk getting arrested. So while I think it's important to pursue a legal aspect, I think it can only be one of many strategies that we need to pursue. And then I have also some thoughts about Professor Rizzo's talk. You mentioned that one of the strategies that was adopted was saying that women are your sisters, your daughters, your mothers, and you also said there were practical limitations to that strategy, such as men saying, well, if you're in danger, then just don't leave the house, basically. But I also have a moral problem with that strategy, because I think it's still stressing the fact that women have value because of their relation to men. And, instead of women deserving respect and empathy just because they're human beings like you, I also wonder if a way to draw men into feminism would be maybe to stress to them how they can also benefit from feminism and how patriarchy is actually harming all genders by, you know, sort of limiting their expression, bullying them, and making them feel bad for having emotions, or the many ways in which men are taught how to be men. So instead of it being a discussion of women versus men, which unfortunately so many people think that is what feminism is, maybe we could make more of an effort to send the message that this is something that we all work towards in order to have a freer world, a safer world that's both physically and emotionally safe for all genders. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Catherine? Okay, there's a question there, and then Catherine, and then...
Hi, I'll be quick. My name is Marwa, and 3 years ago I wrote my master thesis on sexual harassment law in Jordan. So it doesn't exist, and still doesn't. There's no such thing. And I've been struggling with a very superficial thing. I was just wondering if you went through this in Lebanon. There's this whole approach of shaming Jordan. And I have two parallel reactions. I have my cousin, who's a lawyer, who told me, don't write about Jordan, write about Egypt. Egypt fiha balawi. Like, superb, like there's nothing in Jordan. And I had another reaction, which is there's no sexual harassment in Jordan. And this is really like very much related to this idea of saying something bad about the country. And this is actually an obstacle to even just recognize the phenomenon. And I'm not even coming down to, you know, the whole power relationship, what is sexual harassment, how it's happening. I can't even reach there because I have this layer, and I was wondering if you faced something similar. And whether you did or not, I was wondering if you had any advice.
Hi, so just a couple of questions for Helen, really quickly. The first one is, there's this common perception that during the 18 days of the revolution in Tahrir, there was no sexual harassment. People constantly look back at this with a great deal of euphoria, these 18 days, whether there wasn't, or they were underreported, or they were not reported at all, I'm not sure. But generally, there's a perception that for that many people to be in that size of a square and not to have issues of sexual harassment, especially with women and men spending the night and sleeping side by side. I was wondering if you, in the literature and the interviews, came across any explanations for this before, of course, the Lara Logan incident. So that's one question. The second question is, so this has been part of the narrative on sexual harassment in Egypt for so long. We talk about legal reforms, and we talk about public awareness campaigns, and it's always kind of restricted to these two things. And then the law was passed, and still there has been no impact on incidents of sexual harassment. The women that go to report will tell you that the police officers constantly discourage them from reporting. Well, you're going to now that there's a law and these women are going to go to prison, so the reaction is, you sure you want to do this? You're going to destroy his career, you're going to destroy his future, think about it again. And this is common with the reporting. So, I mean, I don't know, should the narratives change then to, well, then you go back to what Dr. Jad was saying, a rehaul of the, you know, you're talking about government now, you're talking a rehaul of the police force itself, and you're not just talking about sexual harassment, you're talking about a number of other things that affect both men and women. It's just to kind of take it away from these campaigns. There are so many campaigns. The TV stations are flooded with campaigns all over the, you know, it's not enough. And when you have these campaigns, the reaction of the public in a recent kind of TV was a lot of men and women called, and they said, one, you're ruining the image of Egypt. Two, this isn't one of our biggest problems. Why are you stuck on this issue? So I was kind of wondering if you, again, from the people that you've met and the activists, what other suggestions? How can we get beyond these campaigns and the legal reforms on this issue? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. It looks like I overestimated how much time we have, but نهايتها مسك, so we'll let Dr. Jad
have the final comment and then we get your answers.
Thank you. It's really very stimulating discussion. I will go back again to the question of intersectionality and building alliances. Because, you know, it is not here about men and women, but it's also about age. There are lots of reports talking about how some parents, you know, in their old age are badly treated by their children or left to be, you know, without economic support. Or, I mean, if we enlarge a bit the scale of, because, you know, this will help us to cross the question of why you pick on this particular issue. It is a widely, you know, expanded kind of act that needs to enlarge our allies. Enlarging our allies in the sense that why don't we include raise the issue among refugee camps for Syrians? There is a terrible incidence of sexual harassment. Go to El-Zatari in Jordan and hear the horrible stories, and it's everywhere. Also about, you know, domestic workers. Domestic workers, they should be part of this campaign. I mean, if we enlarge the zoom of our camera a little bit, we will find lots of people that will be benefiting from the legal reform, and this will change the culture, because we don't want to change the law per se. We want to change, you know, the system that is producing violence. And the system that is producing violence, it's by enlarging our, you know, allies and enlarging our campaign to touch upon all forms of violence in the society, whether based on age or sex or nationality or status, marital status or whatever. I mean, all the theoretical work we were talking about is here.
Okay, I'm sorry, we have 1 minute, so we'll take quick answers.
I'll try to be quick. I don't even know where to start. Well, I will. The woman who was talking about the strategy of seeing women as relatives to protect them. Actually, ECWR, I think based on those focus groups, was like, we're not going there. But I do agree that, yeah, it becomes, there's a moral problem with the strategy as well of not seeing women as equal human beings, and only being, having value, like you said, as being part of the family, and we don't talk about men like that, even though I did at the end of my talk today. And I do agree with you that maybe one way of trying to engage men is trying to explain the benefits of feminism, to be able to emotionally express yourself, to be, as a father, more engaged with your children, that if you actually are involved in, you know, just not playing, but true involvement with your children, you'll have a much different relationship with them than this, I'm the breadwinner and I come home and I play with you for a half an hour, and sorry, I'm exaggerating. But, and Yasmin, the 18 days, I just know anecdotally from my friends who were involved, there was a dramatic, that it did seem like there was very little sexual harassment. Now, I only know anecdotally, I think even Ohoda El-Sada wrote, or Hania Sholahemi, I can't remember who, wrote and said, I'm amazed that I was there, and it didn't seem to happen. But again, I don't know for sure. But even the activists I interviewed, your second question, they do feel stuck too, like, what can we do that's different than what we've already done? And several now think going into using art and theater as a way to present these messages in a different way, especially to get engagement, but in general, not the traditional, we're gonna have posters and PSAs, but to actually try to engage people through interactive like performances. Again, public space, as we know, is collapsing in Egypt as a place to do even a street performance, but they're struggling to find new ways. I will stop.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Concerning the question about the race and about different factors rather than only socioeconomic factors, definitely the text of the law states that it should be covering all women on the Lebanese territories. However, when it comes to the logistical implementation, you're right. There are many flaws that hinder the use of this law by many women. We also count refugee women because when women do not have residency papers, they cannot go to ISF to ask for protection. So many women are being marginalized when it comes to the implementation of the law itself because of certain conditions, not only related to socioeconomic factors. And this, we cannot consider only that this is part of the flaws in the law, but it's also part of the flaws in the system itself, because there is no complementary factors to facilitate the implementation of the law that initially wanted to protect all women. Regarding the question related to religious leaders and issues related to marital rape and custody age, unfortunately, the reign of the religious courts is over Law 293. And even within the parliamentary committee that discussed the law and passed it in 2014, some of the MPs refused totally to even discuss marital rape. They said there is nothing called marital rape. They said this would devastate the Lebanese family, it will devastate our values. So we go back to our maybe the biggest battle, which is the battle with the sectarian and religious dominance over civic and personal rights and law. So do we have to leave the law and just ask for the whole rights, or do we get rights step by step until we reach everything? This was the debate of civil society organizations. But I personally think that we can progressively get where we want, because in such a structured country where sectarianism, patriarchy, politics play the whole game, it will not be easy to get everything once and everything per one time. So I think maybe we use what we have now. And I'm not saying that this is the ideal solution, of course, but maybe we build on the experience, we advocate more until we get the rights of women to be protected from marital rape, to get the custody of their children no matter what the age is, and eliminate this interference with personal rights by religious courts, hopefully. Let's see.
Thank you. Okay. I'll be quick, but I want to stay here for another hour. Marwa, I'll answer your question first. My first point is that I'd love to read your thesis and get your advice. I don't have much advice to give you, but I think you have a lot to give us. In terms of your question about, do we face the same thing? I'm not the best person to speak to that. I'm not from Lebanon, and so I don't have that, same the familial pressure that you're talking about. But there certainly is a stigmatization around talking about gender-based violence in general, and a lot of what the push for the family violence law did was to bring that out more in the open. So it's changing. I think in terms of the conversation about sexual harassment, there are many Lebanons. Right, it's not a singular place. So in certain circles, and where a lot of the conversation takes place is in activist circles. It's something that's very openly discussed. But when people go home to their families or other places, that's when it can get more contentious. And I also think a lot of the conversation is really centralized around urban organizing in Beirut, and there needs to be. We've talked about engaging migrant domestic workers and engaging refugees, but also we need to talk about engaging other people on the issue. And Aya is doing some good work with that, so yeah, shout out. But I think another thing that I hear a lot is kind of this fatigue. We've talked about sexual harassment, aren't we done? Like, can't we just check it off the list and move on to other things? I mean, I hear that a lot as well, and I think that's also something that needs to be pushed back against. So not a lot of answers, but more questions. In terms of, I just wanted to to briefly comment on Dr. Jad's point about who is included as well. We found in our work that advocacy, neither the advocacy or the literature around sexual harassment in Lebanon is singular and focused, right? It is quite dispersed and intersecting with other issues. That's challenging, but also that's a benefit, right? Because it is linked to labor struggles, it is linked to issues of migrant domestic workers, of refugees. There is almost more data on that than on sexual harassment in Lebanon in general. All of the data is for Egypt, it seems like. So there's a benefit to those intersections, and I think it makes the work harder, but it's something I don't think we should lose. And lastly, Fida's point, I don't think there's time to go into it fully, but I want to say two things. One is, yes, on your point of marital rape and the religious institutions, really lobbying against that. I think it's just, and then, Kafa Nabad and other organizations working with religious leaders to try to move things along. They're facing criticism for that as well. So there's criticism coming from all sides, and there's these alliances that are fracturing in all kinds of different ways because of the context that has already been mentioned. But I do think it's something that needs more of a focus. And lastly, you asked, are we satisfied with incremental gains, which is maybe a good question to leave this panel on. I'm reminded yesterday, I think it was Dr. Maktisi yesterday who said, why are we all talking about this? Let's just go out and burn everything down. That's not exactly what she said, but that's what I heard. So maybe that's what I want to leave you with. Like, maybe let's all leave here and go burn something down, because I'm not, but that's the situation that this space is in. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for our three panelists and for all of you in this very interesting debate. The final plenary session or keynote address is in 10 minutes upstairs, and I invite you all to join us. Thank you very much.